some questions about how you might be using focus groups. So I hope one or two of you might volunteer as we get to the end of this introduction to tell me why you're using focus groups and maybe the composition. So, focus groups, well, at its most basic, it's a group interview in that you're talking with several people at once rather than doing a one-to-one interview. Of course, between the focus group and the interviews, sometimes you can do paired interviews, like you might interview both parents of a child with Down syndrome. But a proper focus group is far more than just happening to talk to several people at once in a group interview. A proper focus group is using the fact that you are interviewing people in a group, encouraging them to talk with one another in the process of that data collection and being attentive to group dynamics in your analysis of that data. So it's not just a kind of interview in a collective, it is genuinely a focus group where you've thought about that as a method. And the reason it's called a focus group is you're trying to keep it focused in that you're trying to keep responses on topic, although the same caveat applies as it does to interviews. People may look as if to you they're going off topic, but it's interesting if there are patterns there. Why does it go off topic in certain ways? What are people saying when they make that link with something that maybe you don't think is relevant, but they do? So while you want to keep enough focus that you've got data relevant, be attentive to so-called deviations. So a group, well, obviously if you're just interviewing two people, that's not a group, that's a pair interview. I usually think of a group as involving between 4 and 10 people. Some people do group discussions much larger than that. I have never found that I can effectively handle a group discussion with more than 10 people. I'm quite happy really with anywhere between 4 and 8. I think for your purposes, think more towards the small end of the group because it's quite a skill to get a coherent set of data from a focus group. And if you have 10 people all talking at once, that's not very helpful. Or you have a group of 10 people and only 2 people talk, that's not very helpful. So think about the smaller groups. Having said that, you often need to over-recruit because people are less likely to show up for a group discussion. So I might recruit 10 people and hope that I get 6. But you don't want less than 4, so over-recruit rather than end up with a paired interview. But if you end up with a pair interview, you'll just have to adapt your write-up accordingly. So what you're trying to do is strike a balance between having a group which is too small for interactions and group dynamics and one which is so large that not everyone participates. In bringing your group together, the general advice is to avoid hierarchies. You want everyone to speak freely. So I wouldn't tend to bring together the consultant in a hospital, the nursing staff and the cleaner in one group, for example. I'm more likely to do a group discussion with the cleaner, the administrator, the men who do the maintenance and the porters in one group, and maybe the consultants and the registrars in another. Because we know that there are hierarchies about who feels they can say what in a certain setting, and also that may be a hospital setting, but you've got hugely diverse experience between the consultant and the cleaner. And what you're often looking for is shared experience. So shared experience is good at helping discussion flow and for people to unpack their thinking. So one question I would have asked of Gareth Thomas is, well, you did interviews with parents of Down syndrome children. What would have happened if you'd done a group discussion? Perhaps after you'd had your findings, you could have gone back and invited people to a Zoom group discussion about your findings and helped them reflect on and help you unpack what you were arguing about positive representations, maybe not being that positive. And you also need to consider whether to use an artificial group that you bring together for the purpose of the discussion or a naturally occurring one. Obviously, if you're talking about family experience of X, then you've got a family as a natural unit, and you can do that as a focus group. But if you're looking at an experience which maybe doesn't happen within families so much, you might want to bring people together about their shared experience, and they may never have met before, and that has advantages too. When to use focus groups? They're good when you're looking for a range of ideas or feelings feelings that people have about something. And that range may be between groups. You may structure your groups to think, well, I think young women might think about this a bit differently than young men, so I might have some men's groups and some women's groups, and then I might have a mixed group. You might be trying to understand differences in perspective between groups or categories of people. Maybe you want to uncover factors that influence opinions, behaviours or motivations, or at least people's accounts of what influences them. And maybe you want ideas to emerge in a group that would be unlikely in individual interviews. And that's one of the lovely things I love about groups, that as people talk, I might have previously interviewed them, but when they come together in a group, I see the way that other people's ideas and experiences trigger their own thinking. And that can be really interesting. And in fact, in a group, you can sometimes see how people learn and take on information from others, how they make meaning and form opinions as a dynamic process. People may change their minds during a focus group and say, oh, well, in an interview I said X, but you know what, having heard other people speak, I now think Y. And what becomes interesting in that, it's partly interesting that they change their mind, but maybe it's also interesting why they're changing their mind or changing what they're saying. So what I like about the focus group method is it allows researchers to examine that dynamic nature of people's attitudes and beliefs and how they sometimes change in relation to new information or new emotions or experiences that are shared in a focus group. You know, most of us are not just static. We don't just hold beliefs. We construct beliefs. We communicate beliefs. We express beliefs, or maybe sometimes suppress beliefs and maybe don't say some things in group discussions that actually we do believe but we don't say. There are lots of examples from my own work in the 1980s in response to the AIDS epidemic. And my study with my colleagues at the Glasgow Media Group was on the attempt to take on the AIDS crisis and the way in which press covered it and the way in which soap operas took on AIDS for the first time, and then also the government was producing health education ads. And we did a multi-level study that looked at production, content and reception. So we were looking at how are these soap operas developing their storylines, how are government ministers impacting on health education ads, how are journalists writing stories. We also did a massive analysis of the representation of AIDS in these different types of outlooks. And then I led the section looking at and how are people making sense of what they're hearing. How are they forming their views about this previously unheard of disease, HIV and AIDS? And in particular, what came through in the focus groups at that time was the role of stigma. For example, the stigma associated with homosexuality at the time, or with sex work, or with IV drug use. And also a huge misunderstanding of how HIV was transmitted. And that came out in a book called The Circuit of Mass Communication, co-written with my colleagues from the Glasgow Media Group. So, if you're interested in focus groups, I recommend having a look at that book or other studies, perhaps more relevant to your topic area, that have used focus groups to try and unpack that information. And what you'll see in my book on the circuit of mass communication is a lot of extracts from focus groups, or indeed any of my publications. If you type in Jenny Kitzinger focus group, you'll find a whole series of publications where I have particularly been at pains to illustrate interaction. I don't like focus groups that just remove, extract a quote and present it in isolation, because I always want to reflect on the dynamic nature of the conversation in focus groups. We're not just talking in parallel, it's ideas and expression emerging from the interaction. And you'll see how I present data that way, and I hope any of you who are doing focus groups will look for an opportunity where you have paid attention to that interaction and then use that, an extractive interaction, to illustrate a point you want to make. So there are some potential focus group challenges compared to interviews. It can be difficult to get everyone into the same space. Now obviously if you're doing it online, then You're not talking about the difficulty of getting everyone to travel to a common venue, but you do need to ensure that they've got internet access and that they can get into the setup, and all at the same time, because focus groups are best when they're synchronous, not asynchronous. So if you were setting up a Zoom conversation, for example, I'd recommend you get people to pre-register so they get an automatic reminder with the link, or be very careful that you know that you're emailing people out with a link and sending a reminder, and that you allow a little time to make sure everyone can join the discussion, everyone knows how to unmute themselves, and make decisions about whether you're going to encourage people to have their cameras on, for example, which I would always recommend. But you should never force someone to have their camera on. I'm sure you've all been through this with seminar discussions. Focus groups are a bit more challenging for the researcher at the time. You have to think on your feet and process lots during the discussion if you're going to respond flexibly in your questions and probes. Interviews are definitely easier because you're just handling one person. With discussions, people interrupt each other. So you don't necessarily hear the end of someone's sentence. So you have to decide, am I going to come back and say, now, you weren't able to finish your sentence. Can you finish your sentence for me? Or people might just nod. You have to think about the visuals. So sometimes one person finishes somebody else's sentence and everyone nods. So maybe you don't feel there's a need to come back. But you need the data to be coherent. And it's always interesting to transcribe a focus group, because you may have thought it was coherent at the time, but actually the text itself may be quite incoherent in terms of quotes. You also need an extra level of skill. You need to engage with group dynamics. For example, how will you handle it if the group is being dominated by one individual doing all the talking? And focus groups can be a bit unruly, frankly. Listening to any group discussion, it's hard to sort of isolate and freeze one set of attitudes as conventionally conceptualized. But I then would say that some of these problems are actually advantages, because maybe we don't have a frozen set of attitudes. Maybe how we express ourselves and the dynamism is indeed more true to the way in which we are and express ourselves. And what you'll often find in focus groups is people come across as inconsistent, as contradicting themselves, and the discussions are full of discontinuities and more often appear to go off the point. So group participants may interrupt each other, they may be playful, they may perform roles, wind each other up, take on devil's advocacy positions, tell stories. I've had people tell jokes, I've had people stand up and sing a song in a focus group. That doesn't tend to happen in an interview. So you need to think about how you're going to respond to that and what you think is valuable of the focus group and those elements of a focus group in your research. So again, if you want to look more at this, I've written an edited collection called Developing Focus Group Research, which I co-edited with Rose Barber. And that's got a whole series of chapters in it from people who used focus groups for different purposes, ranging from very straightforward issues to very sensitive issues. And I've highlighted how it is often impossible to isolate the individual voice from a stream of group debate. So if that's your concern, then I would recommend doing interviews. You need to allow for the fact that focus group data is dynamic, and it's hard to kind of rip out of context. But I actually really love that. I think these troublesome aspects of focus groups are the strength of the method. They create a site which allows researchers to go beyond these static ideas of knowledge and attitudes and think, well, how we think through our mouth, really, how we think as we talk. So if you're not interested in that, you might want to go back to the idea of interviews. But if you are interested in that and you think the focus group is a valuable site, then stick with focus groups. So what are the key steps? Well, you need to decide why focus groups are the right data collection technique for your research question. You need to decide on your sample, like who to talk to, young women between 18 and 24, for example. And you need to think about what kind of combinations. And obviously, you need to think about practicalities. So at the moment, I'm not encouraging anyone to go and set up social or research settings in groups. So I would recommend online, but maybe you're already part of a network, or maybe you're confident you can get a site with good airflow and mask wearing or testing. So obviously you need to be responsible for yourself and your participants. You don't want to set up a focus group and then find a week later everyone's got COVID. So whatever you're doing, you need to work out the practicalities. Can everyone access the technology? And if you're relying on technology, who are you excluding because they can't access technology? How are you going to recruit? I mean, these questions also, of course, relate to interviews. Will people want to join in? Will they actually do so on the day? You need your information sheet for participants. You need your own set of questions to guide your facilitation of the group. And you need to think how you're going to record the discussion. If it's on Zoom, you can obviously record either to the cloud or onto your machine. If you go on the cloud, you can create an automatic rough transcript. It isn't a high-quality transcript, but it can help you navigate. Obviously, you need to make sure you have the consent from your participants to do that. So get really familiar with your technology you're using. In the same way as if you're doing it face-to-face, be really familiar with your venue, know you can get in, know you've got a key, know how to open the windows, you know what happens if the fire alarm goes off. This is all about familiarising yourself with the site such that you are really looking after your research participants and your brain can focus on facilitating the discussion and isn't distracted by being 10 minutes late because you couldn't find your way to the venue, or suddenly finding the front doors locked and everyone has to come down the back and you're sticking up signposts for the first 10 minutes instead of facilitating the discussion. And of course, you'll need ethics to think about your ethics consent. Now, we talked about interviewing and focus groups about kind of how to do and why to do, but of course part of a method is also your data analysis technique. And what you're often trying to do is to make sense and find patterns in your raw data. So the transcript, for example, or the recording is your raw data. You're not just going to reproduce that. So you're going to have to think about how you're going to analyse it. And that would be part of what you think about when you're doing your research proposal, just as you might say, I'm having this sample of text and I'm going to use visual analysis or content analysis. In the same way, if you're going to do focus groups, you need to think a bit about how you're going to sort through the data. There are software packages which will search out particular keywords in your transcript. Personally, that kind of quantitative number crunching is not an approach that I would value. And even with my work on AIDS, where I think I did 52 focus groups, I just sat and familiarised myself with every one of those focus groups and read and reread the transcripts. You can set up categories and code them. You can think about splitting the transcription by subjects or by the questions you asked, if you want to compare across your data. Same with interviews. And here is some further reading. If you're going to use focus groups, that I'd recommend you dip into for thinking about it with your research proposal if you want to understand more about focus groups. So that's focus groups. Questions from those of you who are maybe using focus groups. What's that prompted you to think about or reflect on for your own focus groups?